Welcome to the Bible Search and Rescue podcast. My name is Chad Vinters. I am the host of Bible Search and Rescue. Bible Search and Rescue is part of the West Star Institute. And today we have got a really exciting interview for our podcast. We will be talking to Nina Livesey. Nina is a professor emerita at Oklahoma University. She has been a West Star Scholar for over 15 years. She has a co-chair, she's currently co-chairing the Christianity Seminar. She was a part of the first Christianity Seminar, the Acts Seminar. She's been the forum editor for West Star. And today we're discussing her third book, and it is a really fascinating story about Paul or the letters of Paul and their context. The book is The Letters of Paul in Their Roman Literary Context, Reassessing Apostolic Authorship from Cambridge Press. Nina, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you, Chad. What a
Okay.
wonderful entree there for me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I am so excited. So I was telling Nina that one of our scholars, Celine Lilly, had mentioned this book was coming out back in November. And when she shared what the topic was, I was really excited and I knew we had to get Nina on for this podcast. All right, so Nina, we'll kind of work our way in and build up to what the big reveal is for the book. But obviously, it's a look at Paul or the letters of Paul in their Roman literary context. So, when did you begin your investigation into Paul?
Well, I've been interested in Paul um, since, wow, the 1990s, probably. Paul was definitely featured in my master's thesis and central focus of my dissertation. So I've been interested in Paul, the Pauline letters,
Hmm.
largely from the perspective of the Jewish law. And that really got to me very early in the time of my master's thesis, as I said, mid 90s. Why um, was there this antinomianism or against the law
Mm.
um, that I found that upsetting and very curious. And that has kept me on Paul really for all this time. But I've taken various trajectories with my study of Paul.
Sure.
So this book is an outgrowth of lots of study on Paul. But this particular investigation, which is maybe more of what your question is, where I began to question Pauline authorship of the seven authentic letters, that didn't start until later. And actually, it's a surprise to me, Nina, because I didn't take that perspective at all. I
Hmm.
went along with this authentic perspective. That's all I was told about. That's all I was trained in. There was no other perspective. I just assumed these seven letters are authentic and Paul wrote them. Paul, mid first century figure, wrote them. But in 2018, I began to doubt Pauline authorship. And that came about through additional study on the Apostle Paul,
Hmm.
naturally. And from it was an outgrowth actually of this second book. On that second book, I took up Paul from a rhetorical perspective, a hard rhetorical perspective. I looked at the strategies of Paul and I assumed Paul was the author. Okay. And I wanted to see the way he's arguing to try to understand why he's making the arguments that he is making. Again, I had Paul as author.
Hmm.
But in the course of that study, Galatians and the Rhetoric of Crisis, I found that the autobiographical sections, which I concentrated on in Galatians, certain events like the incident at Antioch, and even how the apostle speaks to his purported Galatian audience, they all appear to be strongly authorial creations, authorial strategies. And that caused me, well, the study itself put me in the shoes of the author, because I'm always thinking, well, how did the author do this? And then asking, why did the author do this? What are the points this author is trying to make? So I'm thinking in terms of author, and I think that framework made me think about who that author could be. And that put the seeds, you might say, initial seeds of doubt of Paul as the author. Was Paul actually the author?
Mm-hmm.
That was a 2016 book, but it wasn't really until 2018, which is what I said, that I really began to question Paul as author.
Mm-hmm.
And what the first thing I wanted to do was then investigate, and that's how this book began, investigate how were those letters authenticated? How were they determined to be authentically Pauline? Paul as author and authentic letters.
Mm.
So that is sort of how this began. And what I discovered was lack of rigor kind of all the way through on
Mm.
the authentication process. And when a few scholars in the late 19th century decided these 7 letters were authentic, the criteria they used were flimsy, for lack of a more sophisticated term.
Mm-hmm.
They certainly don't rise to modern standards, our current standards of critical standards for determining historicity. So one of the criteria was, did they show consistency with the Book of Acts? Today, we question, the historicity of the Book of Acts, so that's already questionable, somewhat questionable. Another one that seemed not very critical is, were these letters cited by early Christian authors? Well,
Mm-hmm.
sure. I mean, they could be cited, but doesn't necessarily mean they're authentic, right? But that was
Sure.
one of the criteria. Um, and then finally, they adopted, which I've talked about and I won't really talk about now, did they show this antinomism, this fundamental break between Judaism and emerging Christianity over issues of the law, which seemed by some scholars to be central? So if these chief epistles were determined to be authentic based on that criteria, so when other letters were being asked to or determined whether they were authentic, they were also um, asked to line up with that same underlying thesis to make a similar theological perspective behind
Mm-hmm.
Paul. So if it all lined up with the chief epistles, then that was another determinant of being authentic. But all of that has come under recent questioning, scholarly questioning. So the criteria are not strong.
Mm.
That's what I'm trying to say here. And I
Mm-hmm.
say it more elegantly in the book than I'm saying it now. I'm summarizing here. I also found, and this was determinative for me, that the authentic perspective from various angles appeared to be forced in scholarship.
Hmm.
For one thing, predetermined notions of Christian origins was forced on this authentic perspective, meaning that determined their historical reliability, and also whether or not they were genuine correspondence. Um, Again, if they met up with certain scholarly understandings of what that early Christianity was supposed to be, because that scholar thought it was supposed to be that way, because his theology was telling him, and it's usually a him, that it was
Hmm.
supposed to be that way, um, then those letters could be deemed authentic because it lined up with their predetermined understanding of Christianity.
Sure.
All of that is very circular. So in that way, it seemed forced. They also came up with some not very credible understandings of an ancient letter. One example being that the ancient letter was defined as being very close or almost equivalent to oral speech. Again, if they could show, and um, the urge was to say these are real letters. So again, authenticating by saying that the letters were real. Surely Paul wrote them, okay? So that was that view then created new ways of understanding an ancient letter that also seemed forced,
Hmm.
forced on an ancient letter, all to my reading of this scholarship, to make sure, to ensure that those Pauline letters were authentic, real
Hmm.
letters. And these modern epistolary theories are not well theorized, and they don't match up with how ancients themselves understood an ancient letter. They pushed it beyond where it could reasonably be pushed. Authors were in charge of a letter. A letter doesn't speak for itself, and that's part of what that scholarship was saying. A real letter doesn't even need interpreting. It's like an oral. It's it's like a conversation, an oral conversation. Um, so that seemed forced as well. Um, they scholars also um, wanted to show the validity of these letters or make them authentic. And this seemed like a good way of going about it. They compared the letters to a large amount of other Greco Roman letters, which were deemed or could be understood as real letters, genuine letters.
Hmm.
But in a lot of these studies, a lot of studies came out of this determination of how to determine authenticity, and they could not get them to compare favorably to these supposed common Greco-Roman letters. They
Hmm.
didn't compare. So it's funny, the scholarship um, ended up showing opposite to what it wanted to show. It
Hmm.
proved the reverse of their original determinations of what they wanted. Um, they failed to be convincing. But at the end of the day, these same scholars rationalized the findings, even though they didn't match up, and said that Paul made an exception. Paul had to make an exception. His mission
Hmm.
caused him to change the way these letters were actually produced.
Hmm.
Okay. So that seemed to be forced and rationalizing conclusions that when the conclusions didn't match up. Um, Finally, I wanted to see, what were these letters always thought of as authentic? Paul as the actual writer? Were did ancient interpreters or early interpreters also make that demand of those letters of Paul? And did they need them to be real correspondence as they are now in modern scholarship? And I found nothing to support that
Hmm.
claim that the earliest interpreters, um, like Irenaeus, for instance, who does engage um, most all of the canonical letters of Paul, you don't see that um, kind of questioning of the letters. That question doesn't emerge. That demand on the letters is not there. They are looking at those letters as though they are scripture, looking at those letters the same way they looked at the gospel texts.
Hmm.
Okay, so that led me to believe that the questions we're asking now of the letters, that they be historically reliable, that they be genuine correspondence, sent letters. I struggled with how to write about that.
Hmm.
Is a modern concern and not a concern of the earliest readers of these letters, the ones who first had their eyes on these letters.
Yeah. So to kind of summarize for those who are listening to this, who maybe are not as familiar with the debate regarding authentic versus inauthentic Pauline letters, many people go through their whole church lives just knowing that Paul wrote 13 letters that are in the New Testament. Critical scholarship has gone the route of determining that you actually have seven authentic Pauline letters. So we have Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon are what are considered the seven authentic. Then you have three letters that are considered questionable. So you have 2nd Thessalonians, Ephesians, and Colossians. And then you have the three letters that have been widely deemed to be not authentic at all, which is the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Now, bringing it back to what you're talking about here, most of our critical scholarship, as you just detailed very well, has determined that those seven authentic letters are actual correspondence written by a man named Paul sometime in the middle of the 1st century CE. But after you took a hard look at this and you just gave us some insight, your analysis discovered that essentially that's not a good theory, correct?
Right. So what I did is I looked for evidence. If we've got seven letters we're deeming authentic, and you well articulated that, and I appreciate that. It's a backdrop to all of this.
Hmm.
So I didn't find manuscript or otherwise evidence of those seven letters attributed to Paul in the mid first century. So um, some of my scholarship, um, even maybe a good amount of the scholarship in this book, um, shows a lack of evidence. So here I'm going
Mm.
through where I'm seeing a lack of evidence.
Hmm.
But then again, you can't have an assured theory, and this thing is dominant. This seven authentic letter thesis is as it's like the rule. It
Yes,
cannot
it
be
is.
questioned, right?
Hmm.
So we have that if there is a lack of evidence. And so perhaps saying there's a lack of evidence has some validity to it, and I do think it does. So
Hmm.
I found a lack of evidence of mid first century letters. And the first evidence, and I'll jump into something that I don't get into until the fourth chapter of that book. The first evidence, and I had to dig around for all of this because, I came at this new and cold when I started on this book. But the first evidence that I was able to determine is actually Marcion, who is a mid second century figure. And that looks like the earliest evidence. And it isn't
Mm.
actually manuscript evidence, it's secondary references to what look like, and this is not questioned. This is in works that we have, in the works of Tertullian and Epiphanius. You can see the recreation, you might say, of Marcion's letters, which are thought to date to the 2nd century. And there's 10 of them. So that already disturbs that pristine, you might say, 7-letter, authentic letter thesis. Because the first evidence, again, is of these references to Marcion's publication, which we know of as a mid 2nd century event, publication. Okay, so that is the first evidence. I also found, which I think you would expect in the case of real correspondence, going back to 7 authentic letters now, if you had an actual letter going to the Galatians, 2 actual letters going to the Corinthians, it seemed that you would find in some kind of manuscript evidence unities, Corinthians in a manuscript by itself, the letter to the Romans in a manuscript by itself. So, or some evidence somewhere that those letters went out, somehow went out and survived as a single copy. But instead, you find that the only evidence that in the manuscript, or again, as I said, in these secondary sources on Marcion, are of a collection, which to me means they first emerge as a collection. There's implications there then. If they only exist as a collection, one more step would be to say that's how they were developed together as a collection. And that is an assumption that I took. Okay, so then you ask about the 7 letters. Again, one other evidence is, and again, it's a lack of evidence. I didn't find the person Paul. If these letters are attributed to a person named Paul, you would expect to find some evidence of Paul in the mid 1st century when these letters self-identify as being written. They have internal clues of mid 1st century. So you'd want to find a Paul in the mid 1st century, and I found no such personage of Paul in the mid 1st century. And no Greek source, no Roman source, no Hebrew source, all these sources, there's no Paul. And then what scholars have tried to show also seems to be forced. The historicity of Paul in the mid 1st century is based on internal indicators largely. There's more than this, but 2 main ways in which Paul is made to be a mid 1st century figure is through a passage in Acts where Paul is said to have been in touch with or engaged with this real person, Gallio, also a mid 1st century Roman figure. And another passage in Second Corinthians where Paul is put in touch with, the Apostle Paul is put in touch with a governor to King Aretas.
Hmm.
And that there was a King Aretas,
Yeah.
and you can date him to the mid first century. But without additional corroborating evidence of a figure Paul in those locations at that time, or in association with those particular historical figures, actual historical figures, the evidence either within Acts or alone, I should say, the evidence alone, either within Acts or in Second Corinthians, is insufficient to prove the historicity of this figure, Paul.
Hmm.
Um, I mentioned that the first evidence of the letters is of a collection. Um, so, and I think that is known among scholars that the collection is important in this whole question of authenticity.
Hmm.
But the collection theories, based on the notion that there were authentic letters, is again very weak.
Hmm.
Weak in determining just basic things of how would someone know where in Corinth to go pick up a letter.
Hmm.
There's, just to me, commonsensical things that just don't add up to then end up with a collection. We know we have a collection. We have the letters,
Right.
and we know that they were collected. So they've got to have been collected in the case of an authentic perspective, or they started out as a
That's
collection,
a
which I
collection.
think is the more reasonable. But in the case that they had to be collected, that those theories run aground. They're not um, uh, well enough critically determined of how a collection based on authentic letters could be determined.
Yeah. And your book
Okay.
does a great job of discussing this because, and this is I think this is a huge thing for a lot of people who maybe have never thought about it. They've just accepted that Paul was sending out these letters. You bring up this wonderful question. How is it that if he's truly sending letters to Rome, to Corinth, to Thessalonica, right, all over the place, how did they end up somehow all collected together? And as you just pointed out, why is it that if these individual letters were being shipped out to all of these different places around the empire, how come we don't just see the book of Romans in some kind of a collection of these Christian texts together? And right, and you do a great job of detailing those theories in the book, but saying, is this truly realistic?
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No,
That's
yeah,
exactly
absolutely.
right.
Well, and it really caught my eye going through that because you're kind of going, yeah, like there is something really significant about that because, obviously it takes time to make any kind of collection come together, and it took substantial amounts of time for these various documents to be considered authoritative, around the Christian world. But you think about how does one man's letters suddenly get collected together? And like you said, all of a sudden in the second century, Marcion emerges with a 10-letter pile of Paul's letters. And you go, hmm. So, in essence, just to kind of touch on the bombshell a little bit for everyone who's just hearing this for the first time, you don't find any real evidence that there ever was a man named Paul in the middle of the first century, much less that he was writing individual letters to all of these churches. Which I think leads into our next question pretty well, because what's commonly been viewed in critical scholarship as the standard is that you have the seven authentic Pauline letters. And then later in either towards the end of the first century or sometime into the early second century, you have the composition of the book of Acts, which details the heroic, if not fictionalized portrayal of Paul's exploits. But you are taking this in a different direction. So tell us a little bit about how you see the relationship of Acts to the Pauline letters.
Right. And I do, Acts is important for my thesis, as you likely know from having read
Yeah.
the book. Um, it it is important and interesting too, that there is, and I don't think it is even in dispute now, that there is a commonality, certainly, between Acts, the book of Acts, and the letters of Paul.
Hmm.
There are overlaps, and um, I very much agree, as I said, with the position of overlaps. And these apply to character names like Peter,
Hmm.
Barnabas, of course, Paul. Conversion, and I'm going to come out with this and just say conversion like scenarios. Paul converts, actually, there's three conversions of Paul in the book of Acts, but there's also conversion like episodes in the letters in Galatians and Philippians. There's um, hints to this Jerusalem council in
Hmm.
both the letters and in Acts. Um, there's also commonality in where the letters end up being addressed and the travel itinerary of Paul in Acts. And I mentioned that in the book. And the fact also that the Paul in the letters said he persecuted, this comes up in Galatians, it's important. He
Hmm.
persecuted the Christ groups. That very much shows up in Acts too. So I
Yep.
don't think there's much debate really. And it was the conclusion of the Acts seminar that there was um, similarities, even more, even linguistic parallels. William Walker made thematic and linguistic parallels in some of his scholarship, and I don't think any of that has been questioned. Um, so, but what that scholarship did, and I think that the authentic perspective on the letters influenced the trajectory then, because there was only one tool in the toolbox, you might say.
Hmm.
Here there's commonalities, but the letters were early. Of course, these letters are early. That's the only thing that we were considering. That's the only thing the Acts seminar considered. And even, Richard Pervo, who wrote this very influential and determinative book, Dating Acts, which actually I think founds a lot of the West Star Acts seminar, was his work. He too had this authentic perspective going into it when determining the relationship, the trajectory. And he also posited, interestingly, because I went back to it a little bit just recently, that there was a collection that dated to 100, um, because Acts seems to know of multiple letters. So then you've got to posit, well, how does Acts know of a lot of these letters? Well, he must have known, again, this author, probably male, he must have
Hmm.
known a collection of letters, the collected letters. So I I think that there was no other tool in the toolbox, as I said, no other way of positing a relationship, which accounts for the letters being before Acts. So what I need to say now is, but the fact that I found no evidence or little evidence already for the authentic perspective on the letters. I had already then determined if they're mid-second century pseudonymous letters of the second century, they're also fictive letters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that affects this trajectory. That's why I'm having to mention this.
Sure.
How I think about the letters affects the trajectory question. It allows for a different trajectory. Okay, so I also then I made another step, and I looked at modern epistolary scholarship. If now these are pseudonymous fictive letters, a collection, and I already mentioned um, uh, they they look like they were created as a collection.
Mm-hmm.
Remember I said I made that assumption, okay? And
Yeah.
it actually simplifies a lot of these collection theories to
Sure
think of
does.
they are all they were all created together and just compiled together. It simplifies things to think about it that way, but that's an aside. But once I had in view the pseudonymous fictive collected letters, you looked at the scholarship for pseudonymous fictive collections. And there's actually a genre that coincides with that. And there are a lot of extant pseudonymous fictive collections. We don't have to invent a category. We don't have to say Paul made exceptions. There are no exceptional genre for these Pauline letters. There's an extant category of fictive pseudonymous letter collections. But they operate on a certain principle, and this affects the trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
Those collections operate on the principle that the person, the inscribed letter writer, the person of the letters, is known. Okay, that person needs to somehow be recognizable. I'll use that word.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then you wouldn't have a collection of Pauline letters. I'll jump right to Paul, although it works with Plato very nicely.
Mm-hmm.
You have Plato was a recognized ancient figure. Later, there are letters attributed to Plato, but they're fictive. But
Yep.
those letters are super interesting to people because they're about a person they already know about.
Mm-hmm.
Who is that person? Plato. So I applied the same principle to the Pauline letters and reasoned that you would not have letters of Paul without the figure Paul somehow known, fictive or factual. Okay.
Mm.
Okay. And so then I asked, well, where is Paul made known? Where do we get the character Paul? I'm already thinking of Paul as a character.
Yep.
Okay. And it's Acts. It's the
Acts.
book of Acts, who strategically takes a Jewish character, Saulos in the Greek, or Saul, King Saul, right?
Mm-hmm.
A failed king, and turns that character into Paulos, Paul. Okay. To me, that means that Acts must predate because it's making Paul known. And it's not just giving name to the character, but it's giving a life to that character too.
Mm-hmm.
Because the whole second part of Acts revolves around the character Paul, and he has all kinds of exploits. makes
Hmm.
him into an interesting known character. So now, if appears Pauline letters, well, heck, I know who that guy is. That's the Paul of Acts. And now what is he doing? He's teaching doctrine.
Hmm.
Okay. And that to me would make those letters necessary and important. And as I said earlier, they very, at a very early age of their knowledge, I think, of these letters, they become scripture. Acts 2 is scripture, right? The
Hmm.
Gospels are scripture. Well, now we could slide those letters in there. They are considered scripture.
Hmm. And this, I mean, it's brilliant, and it almost, and it's what's fascinating is that when you discuss it, it seems so simple, and yet obviously this has eluded scholars for such a long time. So essentially, rather than seeing these letters as the middle of the first century, and then later on you get this book of Acts that clearly knows all these letters that somehow got collected together at some point, even though we don't know how that happened or why it happened. What you're saying is, well, yeah, there's a relationship, but all you have to do is if you push these letters here back behind the book of Acts, you start with Acts, and then someone creates all of these letters sort of building on the character of Paul, which was something known in the ancient world where someone who had renowned had these letters written in their name later on. Then that explains not only your collection process, but why all of a sudden, boom, Pauline letters suddenly emerge in the second century as a collection. I was reading
Mm-hmm.
through this just right, like it's like, wow, that makes a ton of sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, it really did. It was brilliant. I was like, wow, we've really I guess underthought this because as you said, it was just sort of the standard that you've got seven letters, right? And that there is a
Mm-hmm.
Paul somewhere in that first century, and that Acts was his later legendary exploits that grew up around him. But if you go the opposite way, you've got a theory that makes an awful lot of sense. Now, obviously, you've alluded to this a little bit before, but when we talk about the earliest people who reference Paul, you said it was Marcion is the first evidence you see of the Pauline letters as having emerged. So, who are these earliest figures that make any reference to the Pauline letters?
Okay. I too went originally with what your thoughts are, early figures. But when I started to do the research, I found that the figures behind the writings, because of course what we have are writings, right?
Yeah,
That's all we have. We don't have the actual figures. We don't have um, actual historically credible bios of a lot of figures,
sure.
okay? But what we have are writings that show evidence of knowledge of Pauline letters. And
Hmm.
that is a very legitimate question and one that I do take up in the book.
Hmm.
Because the dating of that evidence has been determinative for a collection of Pauline letters dated again to 100. Scholars are just fixated on a collection of letters known in 100, and there's no evidence of that at all, that those letters are known. So what were the writings then that knew um, of Pauline letters? And there's four, and these get cited often. What's interesting, I find, is those are in letter form. And I do think that the Pauline letters, once you have apostolic letters that are scripturally authoritative and important, you see an outflow, an emergence of other doctrinal writings, also in the form of letters. So it's a little bit of an aside. But those four writings are First Clement, the letter of Polycarp to the Philippians, canonical Second Peter has a reference to Pauline letters, and the Ignatian letters. And rather than go through details, which I have some details I could go through, I will just summarize that briefly for you. It'd probably be a little bit more interesting. The
Hmm.
details are again in the book, because these are this was hashed and rehashed in the scholarship, and I think it's still being done in
Hmm.
patristic scholarship, the dating of these things. But that classic dating or conventional dating of 100 is starting to fall by the wayside, as is the historicity too, the historicity question of the letters themselves. The actual writer, was there, did Clement of Rome write that first Clement? These kinds of things are coming into question all, around now too, or
Hmm.
even, prior to my book already being questioned. We're starting to doubt. So, and the scholarship, that more recent scholarship is pushing those witnesses to later,
Hmm.
to closer to the mid second century, which for my purposes does not overturn then the notion of the collection already being out there in 100. I don't think it was. I think it was later.
Yeah.
So it doesn't overturn the evidence or the lack of
Yeah.
evidence for those letters before the mid second century.
Yeah. No, if anything, it affirms the perspective that you have something that emerges later,
Mm-hmm.
which and you do, like you said, you mentioned it's very detailed in the book. So for highly encourage you to read the book. You can get it on Amazon, either hard copy or a Kindle. But it's extraordinarily detailed, and that's one of the things that comes out of this is that you don't just skim over and just make assumptions. Nina systematically goes through these nuances and gives extraordinary detail on them, and it even includes an appendix that gives even further detail about all of this. I mean, it's very meticulous, which is part of what makes the thesis so remarkable, because as you're going through this, you're going, wow, there is really an abundance of information that by simply rethinking it, right, and getting out of maybe what you could call the uh, scholarship dogma, because scholars are sometimes also subject to dogma, such as the seven authentic Pauline letters, you all of a sudden go, oh wow, right, there's a way of rethinking this. Now, this brings us to the big question, Nina. Probably the one that has emerged on a lot of people's minds as we've been going through this. Based on your scholarship, do you think there is an actual historical figure named Paul who was operating in the first century as a missionary for the various Jesus groups that existed?
Um, I could say, um, I can't definitively answer that.
Hmm.
That wouldn't, you can't really say one way or another. Um, I wonder, once you say, however, there was a historical Paul, then you've got to say, well, what was that Paul doing? you know?
Hmm.
And then once that um, comes to mind, coming flooding back will be the historicity of the letters and of mid first century person, which I think that hasn't been very productive for us if we really want to understand the development of early Christianity.
Hmm.
I think it's more productive for us to let go of some of these historical oriented questions.
Hmm.
I will answer it that way because I really do think I think there are pluses in considering the letters as later works because it allows us to rethink um, the dating of when Christianity emerges and how Christianity emerges and why. It allows us that kind of freedom to rethink some of this, as long
Hmm.
as we hold on to the interest in that historical, on the ground, grassroots way of understanding. I think that gets in the way of
Hmm.
of um, uh, critically assessing how things could have developed. We don't have good evidence. We don't have good evidence.
So, what do you think this means for studies of the early Jesus movement and Christian history? How does this perhaps change things, especially if people start to look at your theory about the Pauline letters and maybe they embrace it? How does it change things for us?
Well, it would do what I alluded to just a minute ago. Um, it would move the focus, move our scholarly eyes, you might say, onto a later period. If the documents or the Gospels, Acts, now the letters don't emerge until later, the focus would then go later.
Hmm.
Um, and we would then be thinking, I think, more in terms of writers rather than as um, on the ground people interested in a new religious movement. We'd be looking at scribes who are rethinking some of these categories for us. Um, that flows organically from what we know of the development of Hebrew scriptures, likely originating in scribal, amongst scribes working within the temple,
Hmm.
who came up with new Hebrew Bible works and new prophets who had new theories depending on the times um, that Israel was going through. That development, I think, is seen more as a scribal endeavor. And if we could then look at the development of Christianity similarly, that too makes natural sense to me. We now, with the demise of the temple, the demise of Judea, you also have the demise of those scribes. You know,
Hmm.
who's articulating? You know, who's creating? Um, so that I think could stand to have some more attention. And it also makes sense to me that writings need to be done in a school where there's even just material there.
Hmm.
The ability to write, the people, educated people who can write, who can develop narratives, who can write letters in the name of the Apostle Paul, who have the wherewithal to then publish things. that seems to be a more reasonable location or site of the development of the literature that we
Hmm.
have. And because we see this intertextuality, which we've already talked about, Acts and the letters, they seem to know each other. There's overlap with the Gospels as well. That how do we get that? If you've got to have people working together, and
Hmm.
that seems to lend itself to schools as well.
Yeah.
Similarly, working, producing persons.
Yeah. We certainly have no lack of things to consider after this podcast this morning. Some of our podcasts, are more about, sometimes we do people's experiences in church, sometimes we do, different scholarly topics. This may be the most hard-hitting one we've done to date, from the terms of what what has just been accepted in scholarship versus the reality, because this is very much a bombshell. If what you're contending finds footing in the realm of scholarship, which I think it absolutely needs to be strongly considered because it's an excellent argument, it changes a lot and it puts an entirely new perspective on it. And so thank you so much for spending some time with us to discuss this morning. It's brand new, so as we've encouraged you from for those of you who are listening, get this book. So the book is The Letters of Paul in Their Roman Literary Context: Reassessing Apostolic Authorship by Nina Livesey. It's out from Cambridge Press, and you can in fact get it today. You can download it from Amazon. You can have the Kindle. I've had the Kindle. I've been reading it on my phone. I've been reading it on my tablet. Just so you're aware, it is a little bit pricier. It's a Cambridge Press academic text, so be aware that it's a little bit pricier. But one thing I can tell you is it's absolutely worth the cost. If you want to read good scholarship and you want to add something into the mix of how you see the emergence of what we eventually call Christianity come out of the ancient world, Nina's book is a great addition to your library to critically think through all of these topics. And Paul is about as important a subject to think through as it gets in these origins. So, Nina, thank you so much for taking time this morning and for bringing us this really amazing text to wrestle with.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you to all of you. Until next time, this has been the Bible Search and Rescue podcast. My name is Chad Vinners. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. And otherwise, we'll see you in March. Take care, everybody.